I have a sick relationship with Fassbinder. I always enjoy what Fassbinder does. Gives me the vinegar and gives me the sweet. And the sweet usually is in his visuals and the fluidity of his work. Fassbinder's vision is very dark of humanity, and I don't think you could say any of his work is incredibly upbeat. He's very self-consciously looking at beautiful women suffering. I mean, you have these disgusting interactions going on in front of you.
So, jetzt beeil dich. Die Zeichnung muss fertig sein bis Mittag. Post?
As much as I'm getting into understanding the content, which is kind of wicked, I'm also pulling back and having to deal with, I know it's wicked, and this is an unpleasant film. And yet, the beauty of the camera work, to me, is transcendent in this. The beauty of the space around us. He takes this small space and makes it very fluid and open. He's looking at these beautiful women that can use their bodies, and he's playing the camera over that. And that's the juxtaposition that I think is very powerful. It's the beauty of the image against the content and what's really saying about humankind. I'm a feminist, and I want to make this a woman's film, but is it a woman's film? Is it just about good old Fassbinder's belief in the kind of ways that individuals mistreat each other and, you know, the kind of control and power games that go with intimacy? Petra von Kant comes out of Fassbinder's early troupe that was in Munich, which is called the Anti-Theater, which you can hear, it's anti-theater. And it was a small troupe, and many of the people that appear in this film were in that troupe, and they did do it as a play. You know, Germany has such a solid tradition of theater, and the Schaubühne in Berlin, that it's part of the fabric of Germany theater. So it's not surprising that early kind of anti-war leftists all had these small little troupes. It wasn't that film was indeed the center, it's much more associated with American culture at that time. The Anti-Theater was not only a theater-making group, it was a collective. They lived together, they slept together. So some of the issues that are being played out in this film are also being played out in their personal lives. He is renowned in gossip to be a very controlling individual with a vision, and everybody had a collapse in that vision. And he had a number of very kind of unhealthy relationships with his crew who stuck around and took his punishment. So you can see that Petra becomes somewhat that punishing character. And right away, she's talking about love and hate and how those are such complicated feelings. You know, here you have sort of the personal Fassbinder coming out. His films are about power relations, and I think a woman carries the traditional victim role. And he himself is playing out, I think, his own kind of complexity of both being a victim of a film industry, of life, and also of also being a victimizer because he has a control, he has a troupe. And I think if you look at women, that tradition of melodramatic victim is so powerful that I think Fassbinder, I mean, yeah, Fassbinder is sexually very ambiguous. So for him to be being played by a woman is not that difficult, and I think he sees himself as somehow part of that continuum of, from the masculine to the feminine. He had a number of influences. I think the most commonly written about is his Brechtian influence, Bertolt Brecht, or Brecht as we say here. Brecht believed that you should separate the elements, is a term he used, and you should not allow people to identify with the work. He said, everybody becomes a little Oedipus when they watch Oedipus Rex. Here, he says, no, we shouldn't do that. Rather, we should pull back and really intellectualize this kind of private experience. No longer can you just do this naturalist work. You have to have almost two levels of conversation going on, that I'm not going to give you the real. unmediated. I'm going to make you aware. This is constructed. So you can see the tradition of Bertolt Brecht in the film. Another influence is the director Douglas Sirk. The melodrama in this is pushing pretty hard. Is it credible? Is it doable? And it comes to a degree from Douglas Sirk's work. Fassbinder went through a period of just watching all of Sirk's work, and these are 1950s melodramas made here in the States by a German director who worked for the German theater in Berlin. So there's this kind of tradition in parallel. Now, Sirk's melodramas are very self-conscious to the point that they're cloying. Classically, melodrama has sort of almost a triad of characters. You have the victim, which is central. And there's usually a very clear victimizer. And then what is so American when we do melodramas is we have somebody ride to the rescue. What's wonderful about Fassbinder, absolutely wonderful, is that he takes that triad and he takes out the hero. And he also says, well, do we have a really clear distinction between the victim and the victimizer? So is there that, we might start out in Petra von Kant believing that Petra is a victimizer. It's very clear the way she treats Marlene. Here comes Corinne, and it seems like she's just this little sweet thing being victimized by the kind of vampish older woman. And so what happens in that is slowly Corinne shows her evil kind of manipulative style and changes places. So the ultimate for Fassbinder, and this is many of his movies, is the victim victimizes, and it's not that kind of clear sense of power. We get power introduced through the figure of Petra, but in the process, that power gets complicated. And he says, let's look at the very base moment of how we set up victims and victimizers. And yeah, let's not just do it men, the tradition of men, but rather say maybe it's endemic to the human condition. There almost feels like a kind of Darwinian logic to this film, that they're just clawing their way up, all of them. And with is this kind of strange, loving figure that, and he dedicates the film to her, but she too, at times, is just cringeworthy to look at as she just takes one humiliation after another from Petra.
Marlene! Meine Schuhe!
Marlene is a character, as most people realize, that lurks in the background throughout the film. And in some ways, she is the most victimized.
Rasch!
She doesn't speak.
Langsam glaube ich wirklich, die hat einen Stich.
Die hat keinen Stich. Die liebt mich.
Und dann viel Spaß dabei.
Danke.
Really, she has no active role outside of doing the behest of Petra von Kant. She is, totally the strings are being pulled from beyond. And so the framing of her, you just will see a conversation going on with two characters, and then there will be the frame of Marlene in the background. Be conscious of who's the victim here.
Es hat geklingelt, Marlene. Ich bin überhaupt noch nicht fertig.
It's a beautiful bit that they play with in terms of focus and in framing, where Marlene, at times, she seems so angry below the surface for her treatment by Petra von Kant.
Mach auf.
You become aware all of a sudden who is this figure? Is this really a realistic figure?
Ich komm gleich runter.
Can we really assume that anybody would do this with so little to say? She becomes both a stick figure and also something that makes the film very uncomfortable. Her presence. We could be, in some ways, represented, us as audience, in Marlene, that we're looking at this and feeling that we somehow identify with her victimization. But at the same time, Fassbinder is not going to be that simple. Marlene is doing and creating her own world. She's a free agent, and she chooses to stay. There's something very odd in that.
Was machen denn Ihre Eltern?
Marlene's typing is such dissidence in this film. It works as this device, I think, for us to just pull back and go to a more intellectual a sense of what is going on here. But it oddly is about Marlene speaking. And it gets more intense where she's angry and you hear this rapid movement. And it's the jealousy of Corinne and Petra being together.
Wir werden die Welt erobern zusammen.
But it also just constantly fights us for comfort in watching this film. I think this is the tradition of Bertolt Brecht in the film. And it forces us, I think, to look for the guiding hand. What is Fassbinder saying by having that typing going over and over? Why won't he let me into the intimacy of this relationship?
Marlene? Bring uns den Sekt.
There are moments of affection in the film, and you just thirst for them. Oh, please show that there's some warmth here. And then all of a sudden, if there is, Fassbinder will pull back and create a shot that is, or even a situation that is really people just talking to talk. Petra has these wonderful speeches about the relationship she had with her husband.
Ich glaubte, ich hätte mich getäuscht. In ihm, in mir. Da habe ich Schluss gemacht. Schluss damit, ihn zu lieben.
But there's really not much communication in it. It's almost pontification.
Das halbe Jahr war schrecklich. Glaub mir, schrecklich.
So all of a sudden, she's not really dealing with the complexities or even her own vulnerabilities in a way that, allow her to share power or comfort with whoever she's talking to. This kind of soliloquy of, this is how it happened. But I'm not talking with you, I'm telling you. And again, this is a Fassbinder film. People just can't communicate. They try. And in some ways, in the try to communicate is all we can do. Really isn't that we communicate, but we attempt to communicate.
Kein Mann? Marlene. Marlene ist seit 3 Jahren bei mir. Marlene hört alles, sieht alles, weiß alles. Auf Marlene muss man keine Rücksicht nehmen.
Class issues are central to this. Obviously, begin with Petra von Kant. Somebody's coming from the German aristocracy. She is a high-end designer, although a very devious and unpleasant designer. And behind her in her apartment is that beautiful Poussin painting, which is classicism and associated with wealth and the kind of classical training that would come with aristocracy. Then you have the Hanna Schagula character come in. She is pretty classless. She just looks at magazines, glossy magazines. She doesn't really want to finish her education. And also there's Marlene in the corner. She's just a secretary. She's just an assistant. And the power that Petra reigns over these two women, and she uses almost a class-based, upper-class power. We think, this is a traditional work. Discrimination against the poor, the underclass, the uneducated, those who do not have. But then all of a sudden things start blowing apart in the film, and then you see almost a class revolt go on. The vulgar Corinne takes off and returns to her husband, and then at the end, Marlene leaves Petra. And so there is some kind of progression to this, that in the end, we have the two women that were most exploited leaving, but in the process, all those women use every skill they have to sort of manipulate each other. That's what makes this film problematic, is that women are exploiting women. Other class issues that pop up is the juxtaposition of popular culture and high culture. Fassbinder said that he always loved American culture, but the way he would say it always made me very self-conscious. There's a little bit of irony in his voice. He would say, only the Americans know how to make movies. And, he's in some ways turning the screw in the tradition of German culture, film, and literature or theater. And so that is his way of playing with the establishment in Germany. Then he takes American culture and he pushes it to such a point that it kind of collapses in his film, which is the conceit of love, of happy endings, closure, everything is nicely resolved. He's refusing that. The kind of doll motif that you see the dolls all over on the different shells in the film is, I think, much like marionettes, how there's a larger force. And this is true of melodrama. Usually there's this kind of power of predestination going on. And for Fassbinder, these dolls are about control and the kind of almost dramatic notion of that we are not in control of our lives. And so this doll, her former lover, becomes, a realization of that kind of power and the kind of crystallization of the power that Petra initially had. We can look at the mannequins in the background that almost look like Petra von Kant because she's this pale ghost figure, and then you start to see a parallel between these stiff fashion objects, which are supposed to look like humans, to represent a kind of almost an earthly side of the world that they're in. And here you have this kind of parallel between Petra von Kant being this extremely skinny, almost anorexic figure. In some ways, Petra von Kant is a mannequin playing out some kind of larger constructed conceit that is not her own, but her place in society. And those, I think mannequins become almost like German expressionist shadows. To Caligari you have shadow, to here you have mannequins playing off. We have to talk about another name here, which is Michael Bauhaus, the director of photography. Bauhaus used a fluid camera that just floats. And, we're used to it being edited. So you have, an American tradition, an establishing shot, breakdown of that establishing shot into smaller and smaller parts where you can get into two shots and back and forth reverse action so we can actually hear a dialogue. Fassbinder doesn't do that. Rather, he asks his cinematographer to just let the camera go and just float around. And in that floating around is this incredible framing of different parts of that apartment. First of all, this is shot all in one apartment. It's, a tour de force on that because, the camera gives it space and dimension that, normally Americans would have cut into detail. So the floating camera almost feels like it's a relief in the film because it just feels like something that is loose in this very kind of drama that's black and white and angry. And so the camera will slowly look onto a doll in the background. Or pull out a section of the Poussin painting, or just frame. And that's what Fassbinder becomes very famous with Bauhaus' work, where he will just circle around and all of a sudden a bit of the set or the apartment will create a frame that almost is like a prohibition, that we can't go in, that this is, that things get in the way. The mise-en-scène is really important in this film. Well, first of all, it's a film about a fashion designer. And so from the very beginning, we meet Petra. She is in bed, her hair pulled back, no makeup, and slowly see the building or construction of the facade. The wig comes on. Also, the makeup comes on, and the transformed to beauty. And then slowly, she moves to the red hair, which seems a little more severe. And by the end, she's so exposed that there's nothing on her. And she started out with these almost operatic breasts in that dress that I'm not quite sure was 1970s look. But nevertheless, we've moved so far, and the mise-en-scène has moved with us, which is really powerful, and to watch the decline. I think we also accept that decline and the change in mise-en-scène as part of the theatricality of this work. And again, that self-consciousness, that really you are aware of the wigs, you are aware of the clothing. And even we could go back to Corinne's neck collar It looks like it could be either a fashion object, but more so an S&M kind of collar as she becomes the slave to the master or the mistress. And slowly she changes as she leaves her look. And she actually loosens up slowly but surely. And yeah, we have a nice profound change as what was tightly wrought just becomes more and more out of control by the end. At the end of the film, as opposed to the play, Marlene leaves. There's no reconciliation. In fact, she packs a gun. Whoa, what is this saying? Is she a masochist that will now just go to another kind of powerful woman and recreate the same, or has she learned a lesson? But the lesson learning isn't really part of Fassbinder. He doesn't want us to walk away and say, oh, here's the answer, but rather, maybe this is just endemic. It's a circle, and it just keeps on happening. The victim and the victimizer. The victimizer becomes the victim. And here's Marlene leaving. It doesn't, you have a little closure here, but it's not allowing that. Fassbinder really was the first to really have these national or international films that focused on women, that focused on, homosexual relationships. I think lesbians and feminists so thirst for positive films, and we have so little that we can talk about that you want to grab this film and say, so Fassbinder's a feminist, and Fassbinder's really talking about lesbian relationships. But is he really talking about lesbian relationships? Isn't he a little more, in some ways, into the central nature of victimization? That it's not just men victimizing women. That victimization is in our culture, and it is in all our sexual as well as emotional relationships. He's answering 30, 40 years of Hollywood films that end in the happy ending, which is marriage, heterosexual marriage, and this kind of falsification of how life works. When I've talked about Fassbinder, written about him, it's always, yeah, but, because of the questions people are posing. Yeah, it could be seen as a lesbian film, or it can be seen as a feminist film, because the focus is on women, focus is on lesbians. But you have to think about whether this is a politically aware film. In some ways, people would say Fassbinder is not political because he destroys everything. And yet he does. He destroys things beautifully.